Chilling announcement today that World War III has already begun. As warning issued, no chance of peace for decades. This literally coming out today, Friday, January the 19th, 2024.
And we're back, and we've got an awesome panel together again today. We've got our Mad Bomber, Mike Sterling, Keith Graves, SWAT Team, drug interdiction expert. And again, we got accused constantly of being the CIA. We're not the CIA, so we went out and we got our very own CIA agent, Jeff Emde. All right, thanks for coming back to the show, guys. So today's topic will be the potential that we're on the brink of World War III. There's a whole confluence of events happening, and World War III won't look anything like World War I or World War II did. However, before we dive into that, since Mike's driving, he's bestowed the honor of the conflicted question on me today, and it's a doozy. Here we go. I'm going to read the conflicted question. Our panel will answer it at the end of this episode. You and 6 of your friends left your bug out compound in the mountains in search of game to help feed the group. A sudden winter storm strands you and your friends on the mountain. You all managed to take shelter during the storm and dig out a snow cave. You had limited supplies with you when the storm hit. It's been almost 2 weeks. You've depleted what little food you had in the first 2 days. An older member among you has stated that all of you will not survive without food and has volunteered to kill himself and let the group use him for nourishment to wait out the storm. Do you agree and eat your friend and survive, or do you hope to wait out the storm and everyone will probably die? Sounds to me like, Keith, you're from Northern California. What was the one over the mountain?
Donner Party, man. I was going to just say this. I'm like, why is it that every time I go over Donner Pass, I'm hungry?
Donner Party of 36. Donner table for 36.
Last time I was there, it was late May, and it was 100 degrees here in Florida. We landed in Sacramento. It was like 70 degrees. We went to San Francisco, and it was about 55 degrees. I'm trying to remember who the famous author was who said that the coldest winter he ever survived was summer in San Francisco. There's a famous author who said that. But anyway, we went back through the Donner Pass, and it was snowing, and it was like 28 degrees. And I was not hungry, by the way, for the record. I was not hungry.
I kept saying that you need to open an In-N-Out right at Donner Pass at the top.
Nice.
That was Mark Twain, by the way, who said that about San Francisco.
Mark Twain, that's it. There you go. All right, so let's talk this confluence of events that's happening around the world. I've got some web pages that I'll bring up as well, but we've got a number of flashpoints. So we have this conflict that's going on in the Middle East, whether it's Gaza, the Red Sea. We've got Iranian proxies that are now attacking Pakistan, Syria, attacking commercial vessels as well as naval vessels. And they've really been emboldened because Obama and Biden have released billions of dollars for the Iranians now. So, which is a whole other rabbit hole. We've also they've attacked Iraq and close to some of our interests and injured some of our troops. Beyond that, we've got super aggressive Mexican cartels, which Keith is a preeminent expert on that. So in addition to flooding the country with drugs and facilitating human trafficking and getting illegals across the border, they've also been using drones to attack Mexican interests, and they certainly have the ability to come across the border, launch in Mexico, and attack border cities here in the U.S. We've got the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which is still going on. We have North Korea now beating the war drums, and I don't know that they really have all the technology to do a tremendous amount of damage to us, but Mike can speak further to that. Then we've got the Taiwan situation where they elected an anti-unification leader, and Xi Jinping has reportedly told the Biden admin that he's taking Taiwan back, whether we like it or not. So I think that before we dive into specifics here, I think there's a big distinction between what World War III potentially looks like versus prior wars. Prior to the Battle of Britain, it was kind of an unwritten law or rule that you don't attack the other side's civilian interests. Of course, that went out the window with the Battle of Britain and then our retaliation upon Germany. But my personal opinion is, and I'll let everybody else speak to it on their own, is that we're going to see a lot of attacks by proxy on America, whether declaration of war is made or not. So that could be the invasion happening at our border. I'm going to put a link down below where there was a Iranian interviewed at the border over this past weekend where he said to the reporter, "You don't know who I am, but you're gonna know who I am," and was essentially saying that they're poised and ready to activate these sleeper cells and attack us here in the homeland. And another topic we'll get into is some of the pro-Hamas demonstrations. These are not pro-Palestinians. These are people who are proudly professing that they love to see the Jewish people, the girls being raped and murdered and dismembered by Hamas. Don't fool yourself. These are not good people. So actually, that's a really good spot to jump in at, Keith. And let's go to you first. Let's just talk about these paid protesters, which you've mentioned many times before. I saw this weekend that there were people who were arrested in DC and New York, and then the next day were arrested again in Boston, these professional pro-Hamas demonstrators. Speak to how close they were to actually breaching the White House and what protocol is on, like, say, SWAT teams when it comes to that stuff.
One of the things that they do is they're probing. So right now, what's happening is the pro-Hamas people they're looking at recruiting. What are we doing that's getting regular people out here? Because right now you have professional protesters, and these people literally make a living just protesting. When you arrest them and I mentioned this before, you fill out your arrest report, what's your occupation? They will flat out tell you professional protester. They don't hide it, okay? They need to recruit regular people into this, and they're doing it. What they're doing is they're doing after action reports, which police and military are familiar with. After action reports is where you review what went right, what went wrong, and they're publishing them. I've never seen this before. So there's a level of sophistication that they've got that they haven't done before. They're getting more sophisticated every year. So they looked at what worked in 2020. They were trying to replicate it, but it's not working quite right. It's not working the same as 2020. So they're adjusting some things, and they're seeing what advertising, what propaganda that they're putting out that's getting the regular people out, just the typical leftists, but they don't want to protest, but let's get them involved. And their after action reports are showing what works. They go to the White House, and look, the White House, one of the things you have to realize is, like, there's so many people that come that you can't stop it. There's gonna be a point where you can't stop everybody. And I've been in a riot in Berkeley where we were surrounded. Thank you, OPD, Oakland PD, for come rescuing us. But there's a point where you're surrounded. You're kind of losing hope, but you can't shoot people because we're not in a third world country. But you're like, we've fallen, and you can only beat so many people with a stick before you get overwhelmed, right? The Secret Service is going to be in the same position. They're doing after action reports to see what works, see what does the Secret Service do when we hit the White House? What kind of forces show up? Okay, Metro Washington, the Metro Washington, D.C. people showed up. We got some Capitol Police officers. We got some of these mutual aid people coming in, but you can only fit so many cops, so many protesters in one place. So what they're looking at is, what can we do to take over? What their ultimate goal, the reason why they're hitting it and trying to climb fences and do all this stuff, is to take over the White House. They want to get in there. And what's funny is in January, in 2020, before the Capitol incident on Jan 6, right? You had people trying to breach the White House. Those were all leftists. That's an insurrection, 100%, because their intention was to take over the White House and to dislodge government from there. January 6th, it was totally disorganized. There was no organization to it. There was organization at the White House, but we're not going to talk about that, right? And that's that whole disparity thing. So they have some support from what seems like from within certain elements in the upper government. They have support monetarily to do this, and they've got organization where they're doing after action reports.
So I just want to add a point to that, Keith, as far as the White House is concerned. During the War of 1812, the British sent a party across the border and set the White House on fire. It didn't have catastrophic consequences as far as shutting us down from a military perspective, but very symbolic. So if you take these foreign interests, that would be a huge feather in their cap if they were able to take over our White House. A huge symbolic win for them. Yep. But I got to ask a question, you guys, here, just because this is way outside of my scope of knowledge. Mike, maybe you could speak to this first. You sent a picture of this patch that somebody was wearing in DC, not this past weekend, but maybe the weekend before that. Speak to that as far as what Keith just mentioned about after action reports. And what is this patch, by the way?
So that was a Hamas Quds force. It's not, but the problem is what patch is. So the Hamas Quds force is basically one of their solid militant organizations of Hamas. And you don't see that outside of Palestine, period. You don't see that. One or two things is going on there. Either and it wasn't at the White House. I believe it was at Treasury or someplace like that. But it was in D.C. and there was a lot of people. And these guys are running around in basically black uniforms. This guy's wearing this thing. Usually you wouldn't call that an oversight. That guy's wearing that for a reason. Either he's a LARPer or that guy is actually part of the Quds Force outfit and he's wearing it loud and proud. And if they're wearing it loud and proud, that means they've got the firepower and the numbers to back. And that gave me pause when I saw that, because you can't underestimate your enemy. You must estimate your enemy.
Jeff, can you add to this, just because you worked a lot of your career was international?
I was really kind of surprised to see a guy wear that publicly, because one, okay, there's no stealth involved clearly when you do that. And either, like Mike said, he felt so confident in his backup that he could pull that off. And that would be one. The other is maybe he wanted to let the other protesters know that we got your back. We're here. We're right in front. We're not hiding in the shadows. We're right here behind you, right here beside you. Or the other option is he's a wannabe. He's a guy who is he's a Hamas fanboy who went out and bought some tactical gear and got a patch. That would be the least threatening of them, although someone like that might pull out a gun and shoot somebody just to prove himself. But the other two are disturbing, because that would be like someone going to a Jewish rally and wearing a frickin' swastika. You would only do that if you were confident that they weren't going to beat you to death for it.
Quick question. Is it possible that there's such a lack of respect for our currently installed administration that this is kind of thumbing their nose at us potentially?
Oh, absolutely. If they thought they were going to get a nightstick drum beat, they wouldn't be doing that. Okay. But they're confident that they can get away with it.
I'll volunteer for that. I've got experience. Send me in, baby.
I've got a London Bobby's nightstick that was given to me by a London Bobby that I would love to test out on that guy. But I think they feel confident they're not going to.
I think just give us a room on a ship out in Potomac for a little while. We'll talk to him. We'll have some words. We'll find out where he got it.
Let's just let the cops go. It's 1980 again, and then they won't be wearing those patches out there.
I hate to say it, we need Mayor Daley, the old Mayor Daley again.
I'm willing to bet $50 right now that based on that comment, Keith, that somebody's going to call you a racist down there in the comments. Because they're
racist for saying that because I'm a bald white guy.
Exactly. See, and that's the tactic I now take is every
those
time
damn bald white guys.
That's right. Essentially what we're getting at here is there's a fairly sophisticated amount of organization going on here as far as these protests are concerned. As they grow larger, numbers on their side, they could potentially breach things like the White House, and very symbolic. But on the skill side, I know you have some experience here, Keith. I want you to speak to it. As far as we saw some crazy videos and pictures back in 2020 of these soy boys big around training in the woods, and we're coming for you. And it's pretty weak bullshit, but there is some threat there.
Changing.
Not from the soy boys, but from others. And maybe you could speak to that.
So in 2020, at the very end of all the George Floyd rebellion stuff, we saw a lot of people on the right show up, and they would. And I was at one of those where the BLM tried to come into our city, and we all tacked out and came out with body armor and rifles, and like, hey man, time to leave. No, we're not going to take that. And they got booted, and they couldn't start anything where I'm at in Boise, Idaho. They couldn't start it because 3,000 Idahoans showed up with body armor, rifles, and pistols, and we're organized because we legit have like good militias and prep groups and stuff like that. They're not, they've made militia a bad name. They're just good people, right? The left learned their lesson from that. They have now, it's called the John Brown Gun Club. And go do research. All you people should go research this and go look at it. Just type in, go Google John Brown Gun Club and start looking at all the stuff that comes up. You have ex-military that are leftists that are now training the leftists and the socialists on tactics, fire and maneuver, picking the right weapon, range training, and they're doing the exact same thing that the right people are doing. So the problem with this year, we all know what's coming, right? And here's the other thing. The humans are the only animal on the planet that don't run when it senses danger.
Yep.
Okay. And I can't tell you how many times that like you would take a report from a crime victim, you're like, at that point you should have run. right? Or it's at that point you should have pulled your gun and shot the guy, right? But it doesn't happen. And I see it with cops too. This time we are all going to come together. We all see it coming, all right? When the riots start in 24 and continue into January 25, because nobody's going to be happy. When that all happens, it's not going to be just people beating on each other when the two groups show up. There's going to be gunplay. And you've got to be prepared for that because both sides are training. Both sides are armed. Both sides. And this is where you see that. And it's not going to be like, and we've always said like that movie Civil War's coming up. And I looked at the trailers and I'm like, really, Texas and California together? That tells me all I need to know about this movie, right? Okay, that ain't going to happen. It's not going to be like that. It's going to be ideology versus ideology. And it's going to be pumped in with outside money from Russia, Iran, China, pumping into the John Brown Gun Club, all these other backed groups, and they're going to do it through other monies. And like when you trace this money, I'm not a money guy, but I got a friend that trains people on like, this is where you follow the money. And when you look at these protest groups, it all ends in an offshore account. And where does that money come from? We all know because we do it to other countries too, right? Our CIA friend could probably talk about that better than I can, but we know on the domestic side, I know that that's happening as well. We know that. We don't talk about it like nobody says anything, but people need to know that these riots are not going to be normal. If you live in the city, you have to be prepared for that. For me, there's a reason why so many California cops have left California. There's none of them are left. They are leaving for a reason because we know what's happening. And we all went to safe havens. Most of them ended up in Idaho, Tennessee, Texas, right? There's a reason why they're going to those states because they feel safe and they're going to communities that are going to be free from that type of violence, right? If you're stuck in one of those cities, New York, California, San Francisco, Oakland, LA, Orange County, you're going to experience it and you have to start preparing. Like, are you going to bug out? If you bug out, are you going to be able to get out? At what point do you leave? If riot erupts around you, there's going to be gunplay. Do you have body armor for everybody in your family? Do you have a plan to put some type of blockage up on the wall so the bullets don't come in your house? These are things that you got to be thinking about.
So in the context of World War III being very, very different than World War I or II, everything up until this point in our discussions really been around stuff that it has the potential to happen here in the homeland, which is being funded by our adversaries. And I saw a post on X on the weekend that showed a young man's bedroom, excuse me, going from panning across the room. It was flags. It was like the USSR's flag. It was the Antifa flag. It was the Hamas or Palestinian flag. It was the alphabet people flag. It was everything that you could consider counterculture, where these people are being funded by our enemies. They're being trained by our enemies. So as far as, again, circling us back to the context of World War III, it's not going to be a defined front like we had in World War I and World War II. We've got all sorts of craziness that our own people who are perhaps weak-minded and easily influenced being bought and paid for. Can you speak to that, Jeff? Just because this I think is really in your wheelhouse as far as foreign entities trying to disrupt things in America.
Absolutely. We've done it in the past. After World War II, there was a big covert action campaign between the U.S. and Russia, or Soviets, over Italy. And we backed both sides. But I think you're right. It's not going to be a civil war with defined battle lines. It's going to be more like the Spanish Civil War. It's ideological, where you're going to have maybe a neighborhood against another neighborhood. If you're lucky, Barcelona against Madrid or Seville. It's because you look at any city, you look at the suburbs, maybe they're a little bit more conservative. The exurbs are even more conservative, but the internal part of the city is liberal. But not everybody in there is. So you go to Los Angeles, to put it in political sense, there's a lot of Republicans in California. There's probably more Republicans. I think Donald Trump got more votes in California than he did in Texas. So you've got what I like to think of as sane people living in an ocean of insanity. And those are the people that are going to have to say, oh, holy crap, what am I going to do when the balloon goes up?
Yeah, 15 million. I think there's about 15 million Republicans in California, but there's 40 million people. So, but 15 million is a lot. It's a lot.
I won't take us too far down this rabbit hole, but I honestly don't think there's been a legit election in California in our lifetimes. I believe that they've been installed purposely and that they've been cheating their ass off forever and ever, because I know a ton of people from California, and once you get outside of those major centers, everybody has very traditional American values and beliefs, not the liberal cesspool that people think it is. Maybe San Francisco, LA County, those areas, but it's not fair to say that on the whole. Mike, have you got anything to say with regards to the domestic front before we move on to some of the stuff that's happening internationally?
I think for a modern corollary, just to jump on the Spanish Civil War point, modern corollary on that will be if anybody wants to think back to the when Yugoslavia was coming from the Baltic War, and we've talked about combatants versus combatants. In a situation like this, we're going to be talking to a whole bunch of people that have never even heard the Geneva and Hague Conventions. You're talking about, and you start looking at the Balkan Civil War, entire neighborhoods slaughtered just because they were Muslims, or because they were Croats, or because they were Bosnian. And the gloves come off in something like that. That is the most terrible, awful, medieval style of warfare, where it is neighbor versus neighbor on that sort of thing. And the only thing that you could do in a situation like that, the only people that wind up surviving in a situation like that are the people that are organized the fastest.
So you just made me think of the mass graves in Bosnia that Milosevic was responsible for. We spotted them from our satellites. That's how big the scale was of what you just described, of people killing their neighbors and people in areas big enough that you could see it from space.
I got several buddies that were on the inspection teams for that, because they used to lay landmines in those mass graves to prevent the relatives from trying to dig them up. I've got a bunch of buddies that wound up having to go through those mass graves by hand after those people have been in the ground and they are way messed up to this day. I've dug some mass graves in other countries, man. It ain't no joke. It's no fun.
It's unimaginable for any of us who haven't been there. So I want to just change gears a little bit. We'll come back to the domestic front, and we'll have some suggestions as far as what our followers can do. But let's take a look at the international side of things a little bit here, and I'm going to share some websites, web pages. I'll have all of these links available. There'll be a link down below, takes you to our website, and we'll have all of these listed there. So there's a lot of European publications right now that feel that World War III is already kicked off, whether it be the what's going on Ukraine, Russia, the Iranian-backed skirmishes that are happening. You guys want to speak to that before I move on from this? Like, what, Mike, you've spent a lot of time in theaters of war. This headline here, World War III has already begun. Do you think that that's the case, or there's justification for that, or is this hyperbole?
No, I feel that's correct. And the problem is, what so many people don't understand is that we've been at war with the Iranians since 1979, and nobody wants to wrap their head around it. We have, the whole time that we were in Iraq and Afghanistan, we were fighting the Iranians. We were dealing with them all the time. There's been a number of instances where we've traded shots a bunch of times. And it's the same fight. It's all just coming to a head. And we've been fighting their proxies, Hamas and Hezbollah, for all this time. Like I said, it's just coming to a head now. And the Iranians are the nexus in that part of the world. Joe was speaking of this the other day on his chat with Jason about World War III. He talked about the possibility that the mullahs there in that run Iran might be basically pitting the Eastern Christians against the Western Christians, because they know they can't take the Russians, and they know they can't take us. But if we get us and the Russians, the Easterns and the Westerns, all fighting against each other, that does nothing but good stuff for them, because you always have to go back in an analysis of a conflict and say, okay, who stands to win?
Right.
Us against the Russians. Neither of us stand to win anything. A fight between the Russians and us, really much a zero-sum game, and they're hoping that, of course, magic mushroom makers will start flying, and they'd be happy about that. But now we're pretty sure that the Iranians have got a couple of nukes that they put together, and it doesn't have to be a couple of, or it doesn't have to be very many of them. I'm not worried about the Russians with several thousand nukes. I don't care about them. They have as much reason to not use them as we have to not use them. Who I worry about are the Iranians with a half a dozen nukes, because if they've got a half a dozen nukes, they're going to use each and every one of them. or try to.
Yeah, that's a totally valid point as far as Russia's concerned. And that's why we were locked in the Cold War with them for years. It was mutually assured destruction if either side took action. Jeff, these
Yeah,
two
there's another point here too. Is
Okay.
with the Iranians is they're students of history, and if you go all the way back to the Crusades, a lot of what happened in the Crusades wasn't Christian on Muslim. It ended up being Christian on Christian. Byzantium, which is now Constantinople or Istanbul, whatever you want to call it, was sacked by fellow crusaders. It was a Christian city. It was the head of a Christian empire, and it was sacked by Christians, not by the Muslims. It was later sacked by the Muslims, but during the Crusades, it was sacked by Christians because they started fighting amongst themselves. And the Iranians are very aware of this. So they said, well, it worked once before. Let's see if it'll work again.
Jeff, I'd like you to comment on these two maps. So the top map is supposedly the safest places in the world to be when World War III kicks off. And I have a problem with one country being listed on there, which I'll mention after y'all. The bottom map is the most dangerous places to be theoretically when World War III. If World War III is already started in some small capacity, much like was the case with World War I, the bottom is supposed to be the most dangerous places. So since you've probably visited every single one of these countries, if not close to it, what are your thoughts on these two maps?
Well, I think they're missing some. Like, for example, China. If you're going to nuke Taiwan, there's a good chance you may get nuked back, because if you're going to attack Taiwan, are they going to hit Guam first? In which case, that's going to draw a response from us, theoretically. Another one that they don't have on there is India-Pakistan. You got two nuclear-armed countries that fight wars constantly, and they haven't had one in a little while. But you have Pakistan, who then sponsors terrorist attacks that went into Mumbai, the hotel, and slaughtered all these people. That one could break out again tomorrow. So,
and add to that the fact that Iran in recent weeks has actually lobbed some stuff over towards Pakistan, like inside Pakistan's borders.
And the Pakis returned a couple as well.
Right.
Yeah, they've been slinging missiles at each other for the last week. Nuclear, but it doesn't take much for that to escalate. But also getting back to the idea of the dangers of Iran. I don't know, someone once said, I'm not worried about the guy with 100 nuclear weapons. I'm worried about the guy with one. That's Iran. And if you think that if you die, you're going to go to heaven and have 12 virgin brides, you're really not worried about retaliation.
72.
If you're that stupid.
72 black-eyed virgins.
Well, or 12 virgins and 60 goats, however you want to cut it, sort of thing. So, Keith, give me your thoughts on these two maps. I got a comment I got to make on one of these maps, but I want you guys to speak first. What do you think of this person's delineation? Top being the safest places, bottom being the most dangerous.
Well, I can tell you my number one fallback is New Zealand. I got a bunch of friends in New Zealand. They've already told me that I'm welcome to come hang out with them. I do worry about, like, on some of these countries, right? Like South Africa, it's safe, but I'm seeing them get involved in a lot of crap lately on the Russian side that I don't think that necessarily would be a safe place. Plus, South Africa is full of crime. Why would you go there? Right. But New Zealand is great, but I think New Zealand is going to feel the heat too. China's told Australia, hey, if you get involved in this Taiwan thing, we're going to nuke you. They came out and said that. Or it was one of their press agencies, but they're not saying something without the government approval, right?
Right.
And Australia and New Zealand, it's basically like America and Canada. They're pretty close. You see New Zealand is caving a boatload to China right now, where they're giving some concessions. That map is safest place to be. To be honest, I don't think there's anywhere that's going to be safe, because I think this one, to be honest, I think somebody's going to lob some nukes. And the biggest one, like our CIA friend put it perfect about Pakistan and in India, those two are the most likely to start lobbing nukes. And I think I read somewhere where, like, just a limited nuclear exchange would put dust into the atmosphere that's going to cover the earth. And it doesn't matter where you are. Like, I can flee to New Zealand and be with my homies, but even I think they're going to get exposed in some way that's not beneficial.
So I saw some numbers on Pakistan and India as far as their nuclear programs were concerned. And if memory serves me right, they both have somewhere around, say, 350, 360 nuclear warheads with somewhere around 200, 210 on both sides already loaded into weapons and ready to shoot, sort of thing. So I can't testify to the veracity of those things. But my problem with this map, and Mike, I'll let you back clean up, but my problem with this map is South Africa is 7% Caucasian. They've got a government that's saying kill the Boers, so which are essentially white descendants from Holland and Germany. I don't think South Africa is a safe place for any white people to go, regardless of whether it's World War III or not. Something that's not on this map that somebody put out there was that if somebody had the means to survive in the Antarctic, that would probably be the safest place to be on the entire planet, because distance equals safety, but of course, minus 1 gazillion degrees, that sort of stuff. Jeff, did you want to add something to that?
I was just going to say, there's the old movie from the 60s called On the Beach, where there had been a nuclear exchange. The United States and the Soviet Union was wiped out, and the only survivors were kind of like down in Australia, because the fallout hadn't gotten there yet, but it was getting there, and they were all going to die. To a certain extent, there's something to be said for that. There's jet streams in northern hemisphere and southern hemisphere, and the most of the exchange will be in the north, and that's where most of the fallout will be initially. But wind has a strange thing of blowing in many different directions, so it will get there eventually. It's one of those, you die quick or you die slow. But it doesn't mean everybody's going to die anyway, because if one thing we learned from Chernobyl is nature can absorb a boatload of radiation and still bounce back. The Chernobyl zone, at least before the war, was like a wildlife park. The wildlife was radioactive.
What's the problem with a three-head fish? Come on.
Mike, I know you're driving, but it's been uncovered by multiple news sources that there was a leaked plan from the German government that they're planning for imminent World War III. And I don't imagine you've had a chance to go over this, since I just sent it to you before we started this episode. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think, actually, I got to ask Jeff this question as well. Do you think this is legitimate, or is this some type of trial balloon potentially to measure what people's reaction would be? Mike and Jeff in particular, give me your thoughts on this.
If I lived next to European Texas, who the Poles have said we ain't never getting overrun ever again. I don't. 2 world wars of getting bodied in the first month that just sucks. So I don't necessarily blame them on that. I think the one that really hit me was not necessarily the German one, but the one that came out of Sweden, and that came from official source, where they absolutely, the military told all the citizens in Sweden, hey, you better get yourself a home preparedness kit sorted out now, because there's going to be a war here in Europe. And that's the one that gave me pause. After 200 some years of full neutrality, the Swedes came out, joined NATO, and then outright told their citizens, it's coming. Better get locked down, kids. The German one, I don't necessarily give it a whole heck of a lot of veracity. The Swedish one, absolutely get that one. Absolutely all my attention.
The German one is claiming that this was classified information that was leaked from the German Ministry of Defense. But again, we can't speak to the veracity.
The Germans don't leak it unless it's intentional.
And that's why I asked, is this potentially a trial balloon or something? What do you think, Jeff? Like, would they potentially throw something like this out there to cause some sort of elicit some sort of response, or legit?
Possibly, but I think there's one thing I have to take issue with in the title. He says Germany preparing for Russia to start World War III. It may not be Russia who starts World War III. It might be us. And all we have to do is offer NATO membership to the Ukraine.
Right.
Article 5 of the NATO treaty says any attack on a NATO member is an attack on all. If we put Ukraine in NATO tomorrow and Russia launched an attack 15 minutes later, we're technically at war. Now, the one who is saving the world from this insanity, believe it or not, is the Prime Minister of Slovenia, who came out yesterday or the day before and said, under no circumstances would I agree to have Ukraine join NATO. And he cited this reason. He says, we don't want to start a war. And fortunately for NATO, all it takes is one nation. Everything has to be unanimous. So if one nation says no, it's not going to happen. And he may be the smartest one in the room who's going to save us from ourselves.
Wow.
Chris,
I didn't know that.
Hey, Chris, there is a psychological operation tactic where you have your people release like X is going to happen. And you release little bits of information at a time because you're prepping the community. You're getting them to accept this versus saying, oh my God, we're in World War III, right? and everybody's in shock, everybody's panicking, versus we know World War III is coming at the end of the year. So we're going to start releasing little bits of information. Hey, you release your part. Hey, you release your part. You release your part. And everybody keeps building up. So when it actually happens, there's not that huge shock to the community when it happens.
Predictive programming, essentially, which
Yeah.
which speaks to
So-
the next one that I have open.
Actually, I was going
Oh,
to say
sorry.
there's another point here. If we go back to the Iranians being the nexus on this whole thing, if they pop off a nuke in Tel Aviv or attempt to pop off a nuke in Tel Aviv, the Israelis got a mountain of countermeasures out to be able to deal with that sort of thing. The Israelis are going to start launching Jerichos all over the place, and there is nothing that the Iranians are going to be able to do about those Jerichos. We're talking about the populations of pretty much every urban center just disappearing, period, because all of the Israeli weapons, as far as we've gleaned, because we know very little about their nuclear weapons stockpile, that really doesn't exist as far as they're concerned. From what we can glean, the vast majority of it is enhanced radiation weapon, because there's no such thing as a neutron bomb.
Well, not to add any speculation here, but there's some video on X this morning that actually supposedly shows some missiles being fired by Iran that circumvented the Iron Dome in Israel and did hit a couple targets there. So I'm not an expert on the Iron Dome. What's the feasibility of getting past that defense measure?
You mean the Iranians or the or Hezbollah?
Well, Hezbollah.
The deal is the Iron Dome system. Its biggest strength is it automatically determines where a missile is going to come down. If a missile is going to come down someplace that it really doesn't matter, the Iron Dome system will just discount it and push it all the way to the bottom of its priorities list and go after stuff that's on the higher priority list. The system automatically prioritizes targets. It's very similar to our Aegis in that manner. So if you've got a rocket that is off course, or a missile that's off course, or something like that, and it's going to come down in a field, or it's going to come down on a soccer pitch, or something like that, the system will just forget it. It won't even prioritize it.
So that begs a question, Mike, just while you're on this topic. So that the verbiage that was used with the video of supposedly these incoming missiles circumventing the Iron Dome, there was supposedly footage of CRAMs, so land-based CWIS, missing these incoming missiles. I didn't know that CRAMs were part of the Iron Dome. They are? Okay. I didn't know
they
that.
are. So we jointly, the whole Iron Dome system, we jointly did together. Us and the Israelis. I actually got to go work on the directed energy portion of that back in the 90s, which was really, really cool. And it looks like the Israelis put their directed energy system up on the Lebanese border back in operation again. And yet you don't beat that system unless it's you overwhelm it with numbers. That's the only
Gotcha.
Just overwhelming.
So I've got up a story here. I think this is a British publication on the China-Taiwan situation. So we've got a lot of flashpoints that are in play. Like I said, confluence of multiple events. Keith, what are your thoughts on this? Because the part of California that you were active in has a large Asian population. We're seeing these reports of tens of thousands of Chinese nationals coming across the southern border. Seeing supposed interviews with some of them are basically have flat out said, we're here on behalf of the government, the Chinese government. There's actually two here, right? So this one here speaks to Biden's weakness, which I think the entire world is aware of. Mush for brains. And then you've got China saying that they're going to take Taiwan. Just give me your thoughts on that, Keith, before we move on.
We do have a ton of Chinese in California, and we do have them working it. So as an example, Eric Swalwell, he's a representative. He was actually my representative. He was actually, go a little bit further, he was my prosecutor that I saw twice a week that I brought my drug cases to.
Wow.
His brother is a cop. His brother lives here in Idaho, and I have talked to him at length, and he is a bad, dirty man. And you had whatever that Chinese spy was that infiltrated him. I remember seeing her at different meetings. This elite capture is what it's called. Is they're going after people that they know are going to move up the pike and get them in pocket. And why he's even allowed to be in Congress right now just shows you the communist hellhole I came from. Okay, he's the same guy that threatened to nuke gun owners at one point just to set the stage. I see Chinese all over the place. There's a lot of really good ones that are very anti-communist.
Yep.
That we should be happy that they're here. But I also police an area that had 2 national nuclear laboratories, and we would routinely catch people taking pictures on the outside or whatever. And we would stop, and it was very obvious what they were doing. They have totally infiltrated America. They are all over our universities, stealing stuff. We're in deep trouble. Going back to this purge, this is basic leadership 101. For like, you have a tyrant as a leader. I'll give you an example. We do this in the police department all the time. We get a tyrant as a police chief. First thing he does is fire all the people that don't listen to him and bring in people from where he came from that will listen to him to do what he wants. It's pretty obvious what's going on with the Chinese leadership right now, where all of a sudden, like we saw the one where he was getting installed and they walked off one of his biggest people in the middle of everything. It's very obvious that he's putting the people in place to get done what he wants to get done, which is to take Taiwan. Now, I don't know if they can actually take Taiwan, though. I don't think they have the ability to do that, but they certainly have the ability to blockade it. And then when that happens, he's putting people in place to blockade it. But when that blockade happens, that's when we're going to have a misstep somewhere, and that's going to start it all off.
Well, and I think that's really the gist of this episode of Survival Dispatch News. I'll use the word again, there are so many flashpoints happening around the world. Like Mike said, Iran's kind of like the nexus of this, but we also have Russia meddling in this stuff. We've got China meddling in this stuff. We've got Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Like, there's a lot of elements here where it only takes one crazy guy to do something and bam, like everything that goes to shit, right? So I'll give each of you a chance to speak to this. This is the last article that I've brought up, but this kind of summarizes the international threat that's in play here. So let's just start with you, Mike. Give me your thoughts on this axis of evil, Russia, Iran, and China, and where you feel that things are going based on your experience.
So I have a problem with them as an axis of evil. For one, the Chinese and the Russians absolutely despise each other, going way back. The Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians all hate each other as well, going way back. They've all fought a number of wars with each other.
Is there any validity to the enemy of my enemy is a friend of mine?
There is, and that's the whole short-term arrangement sort of thing. You guys carve up your part of the world, we'll carve up our part of the world, and then when I'm done with the Americans, we'll come over there and burn you terrible unbelievers to the ground. But that's a possibility, and we have seen them working together. Now, the one outlier on the thing is the Chinese so far. The Chinese keep on saying, we're working with you, we're working with you, we're working with you, keep not actually doing anything to help the other two, which always kind of gives me a little pause, and I keep on looking at that going, The Russians keep getting weaker and the Chinese keep getting stronger.
Mike, did you happen to catch the news article last week where it said that the Russians were pissed with the Chinese for sending subpar machine shop stuff like mills and lathes and all that stuff that kept breaking, and they were not able to use it to build their munitions?
Yeah, that's what happens when you buy your factory from wish.com, the same place that same place that the Chinese got their navy from, the same place that the Russians bought all those North Korean munitions from that kept on doing stuff like blowing up at the breach, which is bad when it's an artillery piece. It's a train wreck as far as trying to work together goes, but it does seem like they are working together, even if it's just tacitly working together towards similar goals.
So before I move on to Keith, just because I've got you, Keith, and Jeff in order on the side of my screen, would it be safe to say that there's some opportunism in play here? In other words, we don't trust those guys, but we're going to work with them to displace the Americans, and then we'll deal with whatever afterwards. Okay.
100%.
I've got nothing to add. They're hitting it right on the head. The one thing I do want to add, though, and I wanted to go back and talk about real quick, I forgot to mention about Chinese here. I got to be careful about how I say this but talking to Border Patrol agents, there are Chinese special forces that are coming across the border and we have to worry about that on the internal side. And I just want to throw that out because I think it's super important for our people to understand. And I missed that opportunity and I apologize. But going back to this working together, man, I've got nothing to add. Mike is hitting it right on the head.
I have read reports of what you're mentioning with regards to PRC, People's Republic of China, military people have been intercepted at the border, that they feel that there are thousands, if not tens of thousands of them here, which is a great lead-in for Jeff to back clean up on this, simply because, Jeff, you were involved in all this international stuff. What are your thoughts on that as far as Chinese PRC members coming across the border? You're at ground zero.
In Arizona. As far as the Russia, Iran, China thing goes, I think it's a marriage of convenience right now. If Iran didn't have oil, China wouldn't piss on their head if their hair was on fire.
Okay.
Russians, my enemy is my friend, but they also have their eyes on Siberia and all the natural resources. So I think the Chinese they're kind of a fair weather friend. But where I see an issue and a huge problem for us is that if China does make a move on Taiwan, they're going to want to hinder our ability to respond in any way or to help Taiwan in any way. And that's going to be cyber attacks. It's going to be fomenting unrest in the United States. Look, right now, you've got Texas and Washington State, so far apart, both having energy issues where they're telling their people, don't plug in your washing machine from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. because the grid can't handle it. How hard would it be to basically push that one over? That thing's leaning, you just give it a push, boom, it falls over. And at the same time, Iran could then go to all of its people inside, its sleepers, its Hamas allies, and say, now while you're at it, when the lights are off, why don't you start a riot and start looting the hell out of these big cities? That's where I see it coming back to us. They're not going to be lobbing nukes at us necessarily, but they're going to undermine our domestic ability to move troops, to respond, and we're going to be so busy fighting so many other things at the same time. The American people are going to say, why do we care about Taiwan? Los Angeles is burning.
I would go back to some of Mike's comments earlier that I personally think if somebody lobs an ICBM at us, that we're back to that mutually assured destruction. The Russians have over 5,000 warheads, and we have basically the same, just a little bit less. At that point, it's Armageddon. There's not a whole lot left to debate at that particular point in time. So suffice it to say, everything that we've covered up until now hopefully paints a clear picture for our audience on all of these things that are happening. It's almost like dominoes cascading. And one of the things that we've set out to do right from the get-go on Survival Dispatch News is to make recommendations so that people can survive in these very uncertain times. That's actually where the name Survival Dispatch comes from. Our job is to dispatch information so our fellow Americans and friends of Americans can survive in these very uncertain times. We don't want to sound like a broken record. There's the same old stuff, right? You get stocked up on food and water and ammo yesterday. Don't wait any longer. We know the supply chain's weak. We saw that in COVID. These are some basic things. Another thing would be communications. Jeff, you just pointed out, we're probably looking at cyber attacks. And Keith has a fair bit of experience with this, even on the Christian warrior training side, as far as his 4 church campuses being able to communicate vis-a-vis decent quality radios. And Keith, I want you to speak on that. I'm just going to mention one thing. This Thursday, we have an episode of Survival Dispatch. Well, actually, this is Survival Dispatch News Wednesday. So tomorrow, the day after this video airs, Survival Dispatch Academy is going to be covering how easy and how powerful the new GMRS radios are, that if somebody doesn't want to get their ham radio technician's license and study for it and learn how to program using chirp and blah, 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 that it's a great option. But Keith, you've got a really great option that you use to make sure all 4 of your campuses can communicate. And how far apart are they as well?
They're all in different cities. They're all within, I think we're all within about 30 miles of each other.
Okay.
But we have members that have base stations putting out way over 100 watts. When there's no FCC, you have options, right? When there's no ATF, there's options, right?
Or if nobody cares what the FCC says because Washington's burning or whatever.
Yeah.
There is another piece to that, by the way, just so that our viewers are aware of this. If you have a ham radio and you do not have a ham radio license, but you're in a life or death situation, you are allowed to use your radio.
I program in my ham radio, I've programmed all of the local county police radios. I know how to talk on a police radio. Are they going to be pissed when I get on there? Absolutely they are. But I can get on and sound just like normal and be like, hey, I have an emergency. This is what I got, right? But the other thing is, I can listen to what's going on, right? If you're in a rural area, most of them are VHF, UHF. They're not encrypted. Where I am now, right now, they're encrypted. And I'm not going to hear what's going on, okay? But the counties around me are all rural. And I can hear everything that's going on. I can hear if it's safe. I can hear what roads are closed. I can hear all that stuff. Knowledge is power, right? But going back to the church, we have our own frequency. We applied with the FCC. It costs us $10 for 5 years, okay? Wow. and we have our own frequency. It's UHF. What I like about that is the churches still need to get a base station. We're required to have a base station with 50 watts. And when we do that and put an antenna on the roof, we will all be able to talk to all 4 campuses, because what I'm trying to do is mutual aid. If something happens for one place, we can start shifting resources over there, right? The other side of it is we don't necessarily want all of the members of the church to start getting on that channel and start talking. It's for the security team. But certainly when World War III pops off, our community's been hit, our church is going to be the place where everybody's going to come together and we're going to all start helping each other, right? That frequency, I've made it to where I can program radios that we are now encrypted. And now people can't listen. No, you're not supposed to do that. FCC, don't come after me. I haven't done that. Okay. But when the FCC is irrelevant, okay, just like when the ATF is irrelevant and all the machine guns come out, look, I can go encrypted and I can talk to all my people, and there is nobody outside of the NSA that's going to listen to. And the other thing is I'm on a frequency that nobody's paying attention to, because it's not your standard frequency that people listen to. Right? Can somebody break it? Yes, it's going to be the NSA, but I don't care about them. Nobody cares about the NSA, just like they don't care about FCC if all this stuff is going down, right? They're going to have their hands full somewhere else. Okay. But domestically, nobody's going to, your 25-bit encryption, they're not going to listen to that. And now we have our secure comms. We arrange everything we can do. Are you training with your people tactically and using your comms as a tactical option, right? Outside of that, right? I can tell you right now, everybody on my team, I have a doctor, I got a PJ, I got lots of SWAT team guys, I got some combat vets. And when we all get together, we're going to be on that same frequency. It's all going to be encrypted, and we can work comms just like we were if we were a small team doing a tactical operation.
So Jeff's point with regards to cyber attacks is right on the money. China has announced that they have access to 24 of our critical systems. That doesn't mean 24 points of entry. That means 24 separate critical systems. And it's not a big stretch. We've discussed this at length, that it won't take much for one of those adversaries who's penetrated our networks to take down communications. Could be the cell network, could be the landline network, could be internet data, could be the SMS network, could be the cellular network. The list goes on and on. And I personally, the reason we did this video that's coming up tomorrow on Survival Dispatch Academy is because I feel that communications is probably the weakest spot for most people in an SHTF situation. And I know for a fact that everybody on this has seen this happen, where I love guns. We all love guns, and we like to collect our guns. We like to use our guns. But there's a whole lot of people in the gun community who are collectors. They go buy the guns. They spend tens of thousands of dollars. They have their guns all stacked up nicely in their safe, but they don't have any force multipliers. They don't have night vision. They don't have body panels, none of those things. But even worse, and this is probably one of the biggest reasons we did this upcoming episode on GMRS, is they go and buy a $20 to $30 Baofeng radio that does not have a heterodyne receiver in it and chuck it in a bag. And I don't care what you say, that type of poor technology will not function like modern high-grade communications equipment. And we've got the test to prove it. We actually show that in the video tomorrow. This radio went 4 times further as a handheld unit than any ham radio we've ever tested here. It's the results were spectacular. So that's why we brought up the whole communications thing. That's something that's probably a weak spot most people need to improve. The next one, I'm going to let Mike speak to it. That same person who buys a bunch of gear, even if they buy the force multipliers, but has no training. So give us the elevator speech on that, Mike.
Well, for training on comms, you're absolutely right. And comms are usually one of the weak spots for most of us. And I'll admit it's a weak spot for me too, outside of tactical comms. Tactical comms were solid. We can do good stuff there, but regional comms, I suck. NC Scout does some great stuff. I strongly recommend a lot of his stuff. He's got that figured out, especially even if you start with just the Guerrilla's Guide to read it. It's worth it. Good book. But training trumps gear all day, every day. And if you don't have the appropriate training in the firearms, you can't protect all your stuff. You're just a loot drop. If you don't have the appropriate medical training, if you're able to cause harm, you need to be able to heal harm, period. My buddy here, prepared medical response, Kevin, right? If you're over in the Memphis area or anything like that, man, he does great medical training. And we took the TCCC course and the wilderness first aid course, and we blended them together into a 2-day prolonged care trauma course, which was absolutely great. You're gardening. You've got to make those mistakes now. Learn, get out there, get your head wrapped into this stuff, because if you don't have any training in you, then you don't know what's going on. But then also turn around, learn it enough so that you can teach other people. And you should be, if a subject, well enough now. You need to be teaching that to other people now, especially your kids. Get the what? My kid's a skinny 6 foot something. He looks like a beanpole. But what? He's hungry. He's hungry for info. And I keep on giving him info, and he keeps on sucking it up. And he's gonna be one of the best red that you're gonna find. But you need to be teaching him, right? Don't just learn something enough so that you can learn something well enough so that you.
So before Keith and Jeff weigh in on this, Mike, I got a question for you.
Okay.
Did you catch that there's a bill being introduced to Congress to outlaw training?
That's not going to go anywhere.
It isn't, but it's a good insight into the other side's head.
Oh, it's a great insight into what they're talking about. Screw those guys. That's not going to go anywhere. It's baseless, but it gives you a real good insight into what their intention.
And at the same time, let's ban driver's ed.
Is it racist or something, Jeff? Right. Like, is that? Because that's the root of all evil, right? We're 4 white guys. Clearly, we're racist individuals. So is driver's ed's racist now too? I didn't know that. Okay.
Well, according to that bill, church security team training would fall under a militia.
Yep.
Right.
So just putting that in perspective.
Complete insanity. Keith, while you've got the stage, anything else as far as training's concerned, recommendations?
I think you need to be prepared. I think a lot of people are like, they're going to bug out location or they're going to bug in. Either way, if you're in an urban area, where I came from, okay, I came from the San Francisco Bay Area, which is just 7 million people compacted in one spot. If you're in a place like that, you have absolutely got to make everything so you can run on foot. If you may live in a nice community, like I'll throw some out, like you could live in a nice city like Brentwood, California, the Northern California, Brentwood, California, not the OJ, Brentwood, California.
Right.
And it's a very nice community, but you're right next to Antioch, which has their own FBI task force for violent crime. Well, if you have your own violent crime task force, you're in trouble. Okay. Yeah. All of those people in Antioch are going to flood your city and take your stuff. Right. So you need to, like Stockton and Lodi or something like that. Right. You've got to be prepared to get on the run. You are going to have to go on the run at some point. And if you're a border area, sorry, Jeff, if you're in a border area, the cartels, they've been coming across the border and murdering people nonstop. When World War III hits, we're going to be hitting the homeland because our government is telling us that, and they never tell us that, right? Everything's they say everything's safe. When they're coming out and saying it, you better believe it, because they're trying to cover their ass so they're not in trouble when it happens. That's all it is ass covering, okay? But the cartels are going to come across the border like you can never imagine, and they're going to rape and pillage.
Reconquista.
And you're going to have to be prepared to go for a long way. And then you've got to worry about like Idaho. We know that the militias have plans that they're going to stop people at the border. They're not only going to let residents come back home, and that's it. So you have to be prepared, right? You have to be prepared for, I'm going to have to leave home if it gets to that point.
Yeah, it's hard to get your head wrapped around stuff like that. Jeff, what are your thoughts on training?
Well, the old thing, you train like you fight like you train. Yeah, you don't want to be firing your weapons for the first time when you really, really have to. You need to have familiarity with all your weapons. You need to make sure your family has familiarity with all your weapons. But basically, what these guys have been talking about, I echo 100%.
I'll add to this a little bit. So I started dry fire weapons training pretty religiously a couple of years ago. I weapons train 5 days a week with different types of weapons. Could be crossbows, could be longbow, could be live fire, could be dry fire, could be a pistol, could be an SBR, but I'm constantly changing things up. And I just introduced something different for my training, which when I dry fire train with a Manus Blackbeard X, I can score in the 90s all day long from a stationary position, but I've started introducing it on the run. So running from one location to another, staying on target and shooting. And most people have no idea how difficult that is. And I can tell you that when I introduced this to my regiment last month, my scores went from being in the 90s statically to being in the 20s while running. So trying to keep it in the pocket and not do this sort of thing while you're running. That's a whole new level of skill set. So it's exactly what all y'all are saying here. You got practice the way you're going to play. We'll add just a couple quick things. One of the lessons in Ukraine, we talked about this briefly offline, is that the average age of a soldier fighting the war against Russia on the Ukrainian side is now 40 years old. Go ahead, Mike.
I actually did see that, and that was a little bit skewed by the fact that they were also, it wasn't Ukrainian soldiers, it was all the soldiers in there. So that was cross levied between Russians and Ukrainian. And the Russians have got a lot of old dudes, old conservatives.
Fair enough. And the point I was trying to draw from that to learn from the situation over there is that we have a significant reduction in white male recruits for our military for a whole host of different reasons, but we also have a big difference in the generations. So I've said this multiple times on Survival Dispatch News. Today, this is from a scientific study, actually more than one. The average 20-year-old today has the testosterone level that a 70-year-old man had 20 years ago. So call them soy boys, whatever you want. Our food supply is poison. If you're eating processed food, you're eating soy. If you're eating soy, destroying your testosterone production. And the fact of the matter is that if we look at the Ukraine-Russia thing, there's going to be some reliance on some of us from Gen X to step up to the plate as well, because there's just not enough younger males that are, let's say, capable.
Joe pointed one thing out in his briefing the other day. It was very telling. One of the things he's discounting about in the U.S., the GWAT generation of veterans. And we've added a good 5 to 8 million combat veterans into the populace. And that is a significantly higher percentage than virtually any other country out there. But the Chinese can come in all they want. They can, but the bottom line is they don't have any confidence.
Right.
You've got a lot of people who have seen the elephant at least once and have been shot at least once. And that is a very telling moment in a human being's life, is that first time that you get shot at. And even if you drop it down to, instead of 5 to 8%, even if you drop it down to say 1% of them are functional, what is that? 3 million, 30 million, something like that. I can't even remember what.
It's a lot.
3 million.
It's a lot of 3 million solid veterans creeping around in this country, and the vast majority of them heavily armed. Now you take them, you put them in a leadership position. Say each one of those leads 3 other people. You're gonna have a hard time taking and doing much of anything in this country for longer than a few days.
Well, two quick comments before we hit the conflicted question. The first one would be, and you guys probably remember the name of it, China, through a rotation, ended up being the primary UN force in Africa in one of these countries that was warlords and whatnot were at play. And they got annihilated by these warlords because the Chinese culture is such that you need the next guy up permission and on and on. They completely froze. The chain of command froze because they didn't have permission all the way from the top to open fire and defend against the warlords, and they got their ass handed to them. And the fact of the matter is, not only do they not have the combat experience that we do, the combat experience that they do have the little bit was pretty poor performance on their behalf. The last thing that I'll add with regards to keeping a handle on all these things, Keith's solution is by far the best. So make sure you go over to Christian Warrior Training, follow his channel, go to his website. You get all kinds of free training, and it's high quality training. So the scenario he laid out with their radios and base stations and being able to at least hear some of the surrounding counties, law enforcement, that's by far and away the best way to be in the loop. But the second best way is to monitor X. I don't care what people want to say about Elon or not. He's got his pros and his cons. He's done a great job at restoring some element of free speech, more so than anybody else. And shit happens on X hours, if not days, before it gets anywhere else. So just keep an eye on what's trending on X. And if something kicks off, you'll know about it there first. So conflict.
Just like we talked about before with the Balkans, the folks that were organized the fastest were the ones that survived.
There you go.
And just like Keith was talking about, you're organized now, you stand a much better chance of making it through later on.
Yeah, well, awareness means at the very least you can put distance between you and them, and distance equals safety at the end of the day. Let's hit the conflicted question of the day. I'll read it once again. So you and 6 of your friends left your bug out compound in the mountains in search of game to help feed the group. A sudden winter storm strands you and your friends on the mountain. You all managed to take shelter during the storm and dig out a snow cave. You had limited supplies with you when the storm hit. It has been almost 2 weeks. You've depleted what little food you had in the first 2 days. An older member among you has stated that all of you will not survive without food and has volunteered to kill himself and let the group use him for nourishment to wait out the storm. Do you agree and eat your friend and survive, or do you try to wait out the storm, in which case most likely everyone will die? Mike Sterling.
Dude, 2 weeks starving in a snow cave. If you've never spent a few nights in a snow cave, you don't know what embracing the suck is. And that is no fun at all. And I'm going to be really honest on this. And I'm going to say, that this is very similar. My answer is going to be very similar to the question that you have to ask yourself of, am I going to freak out under fire? None of us can answer this 100% truthfully until we're actually in that situation. And I'm clearly going to say I cannot answer this 100% truthfully unless I was actually in this situation, because the hunger, being truly, truly hungry, and it completely will change your mindset. But honestly, up front, I don't know. I'm going to give it a maybe. That's about all. Honestly, that's about the best that I can do, because I've been very hungry before, and it completely changes it changes not only your thought process, but it changes your brain chemistry. So I'm going to give it a solid maybe.
Okay. Keith?
Can I put seasoning on his ribs? No, sorry. Just kidding. All seriousness.
I got some
Mike,
baby Ray.
Sorry. Mike brings up a good point. When you're hungry, you're a different person. I have gone several days without food, and it changes your personality and you think differently. And especially if you're not getting sleep. If you're not getting sleep now, that's a whole nother factor, and you're not going to sleep in a snow cave. Okay. So Mike's right. What you say now is going to be different than what really happens in real life. What does Keith say that has had 8 hours of sleep is, I'm only hungry because it's approaching lunch right now. I'm going to have a nice sandwich. What does that Keith say? Look, man, I don't want my friend to kill himself, but when his time comes, he's probably going to be the first to die. When his time comes, I'm from Northern California. I read all about the Donner Party. We got that in California history. I pass Donner Pass all the time. I know all about it. I'm at peace with myself, man. I will not encourage him to kill himself. I don't think that's right. You never know what's going to happen. There could be a break that occurs during that time. I am definitely not going to encourage that. But if his time comes, thank you for your sacrifice, my friend. You're going to be tasty.
Ugh, I just got a shiver.
Yeah.
Well, actually, as Keith was saying that, I was looking at his dog lying in the background. The dog's like, dude,
Poor Pepper. I will not eat Pepper.
No, I'm saying Pepper will eat you.
See, look at her look. She's like, "What? What's up, Dad?"
Yeah.
So she's probably going, I'll eat you in a heartbeat, though. No, I kind of echo what everybody else says. What you say with a good night's sleep and a full stomach isn't what you're going to say after 2 weeks sleeping in a snow cave, freezing your butt off and starving to death.
There you go.
I look at the Chilean football team that crashed in the Andes, and they had to survive by eating the dead. And they did. They just made another movie about it, and they interviewed one of the guys, and he was saying it was horrible to do, but I'm glad I'm alive today. I also don't know if I could encourage someone to kill themselves to do it, but somebody kicks off because if they got pneumonia or something like that, hey, all bets are off. And if I'm the first one to go, I'm going to tell those guys, hey, I'm dead. My body doesn't care what you do with it. So whatever you got to do to survive, because you got people back home relying on you. So you got to think beyond just yourself. Do you have a wife and kids that you got to take care of? And if you're dead, you can't take care of anybody.
I'm not going to lie, man. If I'm the one to go, I know where I'm going. I'm good. I'm at peace. I know where I'm going. Go ahead and eat me. I don't care. It's just a vessel. I'm somewhere else.
Well,
I do have to throw out if I die first, California Prop 32, the contents that you were about to consume have been contaminated by numerous hazardous material exposures.
Amen, brother.
so the irony of me having to do the conflicted question today, since Mike is on the road, and picking at random the most screwed up question that we have addressed so far is
It's not just me.
I don't know. I still don't trust you when it comes to conflict.
And
But-
you should not.
Anyway, I don't have a great answer for this. I do have a little bit of experience. I competed for a very long time in powerlifting, and if you're going to compete at a world-class level, you have to have the ability to drop an entire weight class inside of 4 days. So there are many times that I started Monday at, say, 225 and weighed in at 198.4 at 8 a.m. Friday morning, which is 90 kilograms, and then been 225 the next day on the platform. You're not going to win world championships if you compete at the same weight that you walk around as. What I can tell you is to get there, it's pretty tortuous. But in my experience, my body, when I get to a certain point of hunger, it actually starts to go away. And as long as I've got water, I can get by to a certain extent. I'm not saying that I would be able to do this in this snow cave for 2 weeks, but I also think a 2-week storm is probably unlikely to keep you, like, that would be like the storm of the century, keeping you trapped in a tunnel for 2 weeks. And I've spent some time up north in some pretty harsh conditions. My first inclination would be to try and get some animals of some way, somehow, because I think that during a 2-week storm, there would be windows of opportunity to try and do that. I don't know what I would do. I'm not too keen on the idea of asking somebody to kill themselves. I'm not too keen on eating somebody else. And I can't say for sure, just like the rest of you, what I would do in that situation, because that's about as effed up as it gets as far as these conflicted questions are concerned. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. All right, guys, per usual, appreciate your time and your insight, and hope that all y'all out there in Survival Dispatch land get something out of this episode of Survival Dispatch News. Look forward to the next time.
This video is sponsored by William Tell Archery Supplies, home of the Mini Striker crossbow. Click the link in the description below to learn more.